1952, we lost my father. I intended to say a little more about my father a little bit ago when we were talking, so I've chosen to read a little bit that I had written a year or two ago. Papa was always on the cutting edge, taking advantage of new tools to improve his farming methods. Combines in the 20s, followed by self-propelled combines, steel wheel tractors replaced later by rubber-tired implements. Even though he encountered severe setbacks, losing my mother in 1920 when she's only 29, he was left with two little girls ages 7 and 2. Then he was severely burned in a shop fire, losing all his machinery that was without insurance. Times were too hard in 1934 to buy insurance. 2 years later, he was in a car accident that left him crippled with crushed vertebrae. Through all this, he maintained an optimistic outlook and lived his great love of farming through his two sons-in-law, Albert in 1931, and later Lester Barrett in 1941. Albert worked for my father in the summer of 1930 when his first school term was finished in April. He learned then of Papa's attention to detail and his very thorough farm expertise, using best equipment and tools, different from a Nebraska horse-powered farm where he grew up. I will share a story that adds insight. One summer day, probably in the 40s, Papa was showing his visiting brothers around the farm, one being Uncle George from Texas, when he found the hired men putting up fence east of the house. He pointed out and asked them to notice, look at that big, fast-working man doing the work of two others. I made a mistake when I said the 40s because it was before we were married. It probably was 1930. Uncle George told that story years later when Bruce and I visited him in Texas. There was a special bond of respect between my father and his son-in-law. Maybe it was helped by the fact that my father needed a son, and Albert was only 5 years old when he lost his father. I know there was great mutual admiration. I appreciated that more than I can tell. Papa was such a loving example, even though I did not get to be with him often as I was growing up. His love, care, and wisdom were quality. Some ways of his influence were his promptness. He would come and get me when I was a little girl, 6th grader or so, and pick me up, and if he'd say 4 o'clock, I could know he'd be there exactly at 4 o'clock, not 2 minutes after. Of course, great was his faith in this prairie land. He had a realization of the great potential of this prairie land that had been nourished for years by the roots of the buffalo grass that grew here for thousands of years before it was turned into farmland. He was definite in his decisions, but it was always we and us. He seldom used the words I or mine. He gave of himself unselfishly. Picture of one man's family. It's Albert with his 3 sons who were very important to him. And here is his wife and daughter. I want you to particularly notice that because in the background is my father's home. It also was my home while I was growing up between the years of 3 and 6. We moved there in probably 2 and 6. We moved there in 1915 and then moved to Colby in 1920. Also in the front there is a picture of what was the garage, but is also the spot where I had the washing machine and Davy was burned. So that's Sharon and I.
Okay, and the situation of this picture of the sons is that everybody is half as old as the next person?
No, that's a different person.
Is that
that's
another
picture?
Different
picture. Different
That's
picture.
a different picture, okay.
I think a few years later. I had claimed this for quite a while, and I discovered, no, I'm mistaken. So I wish I could unearth it.
That's an inside picture, isn't it?
Yes,
on the Davenport.
On the side, front of the big one.
But there was one time in the life cycle
yes,
there.
That's right.
where
Uh-huh.
each boy was half the age of the other boy,
So we'll have to stop and figure
and
that
the
out.
oldest one was half the age of his father.
I'll have to stop and figure that out this evening, how old somebody had to be to make that possible. So, among my hunting, I hope someday I'll run across it, and I just can't discover where I have some of those stored. I thought I knew where I had all the special pictures, but that one hasn't turned up. But, you know, I have hundreds of wonderful, wonderful pictures.
When did you start photographing?
Well, when we had Davy, a lot of it was movie. But we found out that movie isn't easy to get out and show, so then we went to slides. That also was tedious to get out and show.
Mm-hmm.
So my father and mother did some photography, not often, but enough so that I sure have some nice pictures, nice memories because of the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And I really should do something with some of our film. We have movie film. And the gobs of slides that I have, I should also do something with. I'll do that when I retire.
Oh, okay.
When I retire from these various things.
Oh, good.